something we can do in the moment in the IEP meeting. If you really think about, if you're filling out these transition pages and you're thinking about what the student needs, you know, in order to meet those post-secondary goals, that's not something that I can pause the IEP meeting and let's talk about, okay, let's brainstorm. And in the area of instruction, what do you think? You know, and because really this should be feeding how you write your goals for the transitions section, your transition goals. And so really you can't do that part if you haven't done this part well. So Carolyn's right. Please make sure that you use the drop down, you add each of them, and you're thinking about what does the student need to get from where they are now to where they'd like to be. Yes.
One thing that might make things easier, I don't know, I always put my goals in the same order, education, employment, transition. So when I go do this, I know every single
So I don't know
time.
if you guys could hear him in the back, but what he said is that he always, in his mind, makes sure that he orders his transition goals the same way every time. So if employment is always number one, and then he doesn't have to like page forward and figure out, okay, which number is employment gonna be? You know, if employment's always number one, education's always number two, independent living's always number three, then filling in that page I was just on about which one do these relate to makes it a whole lot easier. I think that's a great point. Yeah.
What did Carolyn say about if you put in a for one of the areas?
What she was saying is that you have to create each of those areas. So don't not create them, basically. So for example, I came down here, this is how you would create them. You would click add a service, and then this becomes the drop down box where you're picking instruction, related service, community services, etc. You have to select all of them at some point. So you should have a 1 through 6. Now, related services, maybe there aren't really any that they need. Still create it and put NA. Because when we're audited, if it's not listed at all, then then that's a red flag for them. So don't let us think that you forgot it. Put it there and put NA. Okay, so I'm going to move on to how would I move from this into doing some goal writing now. So when I go to goals, you'll see that this is my goal page. I'm going to create 3. Like this gentleman in the front did the same thing. I order mine the same way. So employment's always number 1, education's number 2, and independent living's number 3. To me, that makes it simpler. So even if I'm maybe co-writing an IEP with the social worker or the speech therapist or whatever, I would go in and put goal 1, employment, goal 2. So when they start adding their goals, that you don't have to go back and renumber them for a different section because now yours got bumped to 4, 5, and 6 or whatever. So stick them in there, and then you should have a goal statement for each of them. So I'm going to take a look at employment first. When you go into the employment section, you'll notice the top box talks about what is her current academic achievement or functional performance relative to this goal that we're developing. So in my case, I said, well, you know, Sally sat down. Now she did the activity, the assessment prior to the IEP meeting. Why? Why is it important that they're doing these assessments before you get to the IEP meeting? Because we need that information to write these goals, right? What I should not see is a goal that says, Sally will take the career clusters inventory this year. Sally will take the COPS assessment this year. Sally will do, that's not, that. Now we're out of order. We do the assessment first so we can get the results, so we can draft the secondary transition, so we can draft the goals. Does that make sense? We need to go in that order. It should all be related. Go ahead.
Okay, so example, 7th grader takes 2 of them, one's in the fall and one's in the spring. And I said, you're obviously going to do the fall one, but the spring one, do you wait or do you go ahead and do it?
That's completely up to you. So we're saying that we would like them done, you know, one first, second semester.
Before that, you need to do
Absolutely. So what's going to happen is my IEP's in August, so I administer the fall ones, but I haven't got to the spring set yet. But guess what? They did a spring one last year that's probably not in the IEP yet. Do you see what I'm saying? So you could go ahead and summarize both of those.
Or just do the one that you're supposed to do.
Or do the one that you're supposed to. I'll leave that up to you. As long as you're getting them all done, then I'm pretty excited. So I went ahead and included. This is an assessment result. Here is proof that I gave an assessment. Here is the outcome of that assessment. And it kind of lists for them, okay? These were her career clusters of interest. and this is where we're at in regards to employment currently. Her overall goal, I stated, by May of 18, Sally will narrow her interest clusters from 3 down to 1 by gathering specific information about a minimum of 2 professions in each identified cluster. And as far as, well, what is specific information, what education's needed, what would her gross earnings be, what responsibilities would she have. So I want her to do some research about these different clusters so she can start saying, that's not for me, or yeah, that sounds really interesting. As far as my objectives, how is she going to narrow that? I have broken it down by, I want her to, during the first quarter, just look at law, public safety, and security and find 2 professions that she could research in that area. And I do that each quarter by each cluster, and then you'll see 4th quarter I'm targeting that Sally will identify the career cluster in which she has the most interest in pursuing through local community college, which she's already identified. So do you see how that assessment led to additional activities or research or knowledge so that she could narrow that scope, and hopefully by the end of the year I've got it down to 1 career cluster. Does that make sense?
What about just asking for a friend?
Sure.
The ILS 3B.5A.
Thank you. So what he's asking, what's kind of this wild acronym at the end here of the overall goal, and that is the learning standard. So that's the Illinois Learning Standard. It's not a Common Core standard. You would either be putting a Common Core standard here or an Illinois Learning Standard here. This particular Illinois Learning Standard links to the social emotional standards, and those talk specifically about that the student is making a plan for post-secondary, or they're implementing a plan, or they're learning to work in groups. It's more of those social emotional goals. I find that those obviously tie to post-secondary most easily.
Are you pulling that off ISB?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Would we use essential elements for CBE?
So the question down front is, would we use the essential elements for CBE? Yes, that could be your equivalent. But you have to still link a standard to your goal. Just because it's transition and it's not reading or math doesn't mean we get a free pass. There should still be a standard link there. I did want to just maybe then talk about, oh shoot, here's another example of education. Again, these don't have to be what you write, but I did provide some information about where is Sally right now. Well, she's diagnosed with ADHD. She currently reports to the school nurse daily for medication management. She requires certain classroom accommodations in order to make adequate progress. She's interested in attending Lincoln Land. She's currently unfamiliar about the school services, admission requirements, and academic program offerings. So that gives me a baseline of where is Sally in regards to learning more about post-secondary education. My goal then has to do with a lot of those skills or activities that I identified on the secondary transition page that she would need in order to take a step closer to being prepared for enrollment or becoming a nurse, whatever her goals are. So I have that she'll research the admission requirements, she'll participate in a tour, she'll identify how to apply to Lincoln Land, and she'll identify how to access the accessibility services or the disability services department of Lincoln Land in order to pursue enrollment down the road. And then I've just kind of breaking those down quarterly. You can do this any way you want. I'm just giving you one example of what that could look like. But you can see a nice connection now between those transition pages where we said these are some additional activities that she may need in order to be better prepared, and now they're included in my goals. So everything should be tied together nice and neat. Questions about any of that so far? The last one has to do with independent living. And for Sally specifically, we were targeting recording academic responsibilities in her student agenda, completing her driver's education training, and stating information regarding her medication management. And I've specified again what medication she takes, what the purpose of that medication is, its administration guidelines, and any side effects. That's making her more independent as an adult. She's going to need those things if she wants to live on her own someday, or she wants to be successful and manage her ADHD as she currently is with external supports right now. So then I just broke those down as objectives. So you can kind of see that it should all link nicely. Again, this is only one example. I understand it's impossible to provide you with one student that all of you can take back and say, oh, that works perfectly for the kids I work with. I understand that. But that's why I try to give you like the list of activities and things under the related services or transition services that might help you start to brainstorm what some of those things may be. Questions on the goals at all? Okay, the last thing that I wanted to cover is SOPs, or the summary of performance, that you can find under notices. And the summary of performance really is just a nice summary that identifies basically where the student is performing upon exit, what accommodations they may need, what it takes into account what their perspective is, whether or not they'll participate in the post-school survey, and those types of things. All of you hopefully know that a summary of performance needs to be completed before the child exits. So if I'm a senior and I want to graduate in December, I need to do the SOP before December because it requires the student's signature and their input. If they are graduating in May like everybody else, I need to do it by then. If they are sticking around and maybe doing a transitional program or not aging out till 22, then I would want to do it upon exit. So this has to be done before they leave. I know in our district we're faced with a lot of transient kids, and so I often say, if in doubt, do it early in the senior year and you have it done. Because then if they get up and move, or they graduate early or whatever, you've covered your bases and you have that already accomplished. Basically, you're going to just kind of walk through and fill in this information: who's completing the form, what are this child's desired post-secondary goals. Hopefully by the time they're the senior, we've kind of narrowed that scope and it's pretty clear and specific about what they'd like to do in the area of education and training, employment, or independent living. And then this part, the summary of the student's performance. So we're talking about where are they performing in a lot of these different areas, and I've just given you like an example of what kind of information you may include in that. It doesn't need to be this per se, but it also tells you what topics they would like you to address. For example, in academics, try to talk about where they are performing in these areas. Functional should have to do with attention, organization, social skills, and self-advocacy. So summarizing kind of where they are at in each of those areas and what assessments have been given to back up that information. So you can kind of read through each of that. You'll notice under independent living, we've done a lot of assessments that are listed under your secondary transition pages that you can go ahead and include here. Obviously, I could have included more, but I'm just trying to give you an example. Maybe there's an area where their communication is age appropriate, for example. You still want to fill it in with a statement that says that at a minimum. And then of course, career and vocational. So you're summarizing kind of where they are at. I always think about this as if I was handing this student off to the next quote unquote case manager at grade 13, what would be really important to tell them about Sally so they could pick up and educate her? They would need to know her reading level. They'd need to know her math skills. They would need to know, what her attention and concentration is like, whether she has self-advocacy skills, what her vocational interests are, et cetera, et cetera. So kind of think of it that way when you're completing those. And then recommendations for post-school. So what accommodations and modifications might they need, and what linkages might be necessary for that assistance in the future. So for example, Sally Sample, she wanted to go to Lincoln Land. So I actually looked up who's the accessibility coordinator at Lincoln Land, happened to be a former teacher of mine at Rochester, and I put all of her information in there so that Sally Sample has that when they walk out the door. She has that information. And what accommodations might she need when she's at Lincoln Land if she's enrolling in a class? So I kind of included some examples there. Obviously, Sally doesn't need anything for independent living, but I gave you an example of what linkage you might be including in that if your student did need something like that. Under community and rec, I've done like the Springfield Park District before, depending on where the student resides and whether or not that would be a rec and leisure option for them. So you can kind of think about those types of things. The student perspective is completed by them, so this is just like their quote-unquote little interview. If you have a higher functioning student, you can hand them those and they can complete it themselves. If you have a student that's not very thorough or likes to write one-word answers, I would suggest doing this verbally with them so you can get as much information documented as possible. And then from their perspective, what accommodations do they think that they may need? And then how was it completed? Was it completed with adult assistance, independently, etc.? This next tab has to do with whether or not we can contact them and how they are planning to exit school. So Sally's going to exit with a diploma, and these are her goals currently. And then under administration, that's just basically whether or not we have consent to contact them for that follow-up survey. Then you're printing the whole thing. Those of you that do SOPs know that the student signature has to be on the SOP when you turn it in. And that's why I said, if in doubt, do it earlier in that senior year so that you don't take the chance of not being able to get a signature from them. Okay, so that's a lot of information. I apologize that I kind of ran through it pretty quickly. Hopefully you've gotten some good information that you can reference throughout the year and at least has got you started thinking. Please don't pack up yet, because before you go, I want to remind you, if you don't have enough vocational folders in district, we have plenty of vocational folders here. Feel free to take 5 or 8 or however many that you need so that you have access to those. Remember, a vocational folder should be in every student's file that you have. We're also going to pass out the CPDU form so that you have that. Keep in mind, you also need to do an evaluation for us in terms